The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, Margaret Hollis had already told half of Harlan Creek that the woman Caleb Whitaker sent for was nothing but a desperate spinster who'd answered a cattleman's advertisement like a dog answering a dinner bell. Plain as a fence post, Margaret said, loud enough for the postmaster to hear. No family money, no connections, and past 30, which means past useful, if you ask me. Nobody asked her, but nobody stopped her either. That was the thing about Harlan Creek, Montana, in the autumn of 1883. People didn't stop each other from saying cruel things. They just stood there and let the cruelty move through the air like weather, like something that couldn't be helped. Before the story of Evelyn Mercer begins, before the fences she mended and the fever she fought and the broken man she refused to give up on, there is a moment you need to understand. It happened on the platform of the Harlan Creek train depot, on a cold October morning when the mountains had already gone gray at their peaks, and the wind had that particular bite that tells you winter isn't coming so much as it's already arrived and simply hasn't unpacked yet. Evelyn stepped off the train with a worn leather bag in one hand and a piece of folded paper in the other. The paper had Caleb Whitaker's name on it and an address and 3 lines of description about the position she'd been hired to fill. She'd read those 3 lines so many times during the 2-day journey that the paper had gone soft at the folds. She was 32 years old. She had $31 to her name. She had no husband, no prospects, and a family back in Ohio that had quietly stopped expecting her to amount to much. She stepped onto the platform and looked around, and that's when she heard it. Lord have mercy, she's even plainer than the advertisement suggested. The voice belonged to Margaret Hollis, who was standing not 6 feet away with 2 other women whose names Evelyn wouldn't learn until later. Margaret wasn't whispering. She wasn't even trying to whisper. She was speaking in the full, confident voice of a woman who had never once been made to feel small, and therefore had no idea what smallness felt like from the inside. Evelyn stopped walking. If you've ever felt like the person in the room that everyone has already decided about before you've opened your mouth, if you've ever walked into a place and felt the judgment land on you like something physical, like a hand on your chest pushing you back, then you already know something about Evelyn Mercer. And if you want to know what happened next, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel and follow along, because what Evelyn did on that frontier, what she built out of nothing, in a place that didn't want her, for a family that didn't know yet that they needed her, is the kind of story that stays with you. Hit the like button. Leave a comment with your city and country so I can see how far this story has traveled. And let's begin. The wagon that came to collect Evelyn from the depot was driven by a man named Hector Briggs, who worked part-time for Caleb Whitaker and full-time for his own mild indifference to everything around him. He didn't offer to take her bag. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence that needs repainting, noting the work involved without any particular enthusiasm for doing it. "You the woman from Ohio?" he said. "I am." Whitaker said to bring you out to the ranch. He climbed back onto the wagon seat. "Suit yourself whether you get on." She got on. The ride took the better part of an hour, and Hector Briggs said nothing for most of it, which suited Evelyn fine because she was busy looking at the landscape and trying to understand what she'd agreed to. The Montana Territory in October was not what she'd imagined. She'd grown up with Ohio's gentle hills, its tidy farmland, its sense that the earth had been made manageable by generations of careful hands. This was different. This was a landscape that made you feel small on purpose, that had no interest in being managed or made gentle, that sat under that enormous gray sky with a kind of indifference that was almost insulting. She found herself thinking about the advertisement she'd answered, seeking capable woman for household management and child-rearing assistance, widower, 3 children, working ranch outside Harlan Creek, Montana. Honest work, fair wages, private room. References required. Right to see. Whitaker, Box 14. Capable. That was the word she'd fixed on. Not beautiful, not young, not well-connected. Capable. She could be capable. She'd been capable her whole life in ways that had never once been rewarded, but had kept her and the people around her from falling apart on multiple occasions. She thought about her mother, who had said, when Evelyn told her about the advertisement, "Montana, Evelyn, that's practically the end of the earth." "I know." "You don't know anybody there." "I know." "You could stay here. Your Aunt Vera needs help with the—" "I know what Aunt Vera needs, Mama." She'd said it gently because she was always gentle with her mother, even when gentleness cost her something. I need something different. Her mother had looked at her with that expression, the worried one, the one that also contained, somewhere underneath the worry, a layer of resigned acceptance that Evelyn had learned to recognize over 32 years. The expression that said, I wish things were different for you, but I don't know how to make them different, and I'm not sure they can be. Evelyn had kissed her cheek and packed her bag and bought a train ticket with the last of what she'd saved from 3 years of working as a seamstress, a teacher's aide, and for 8 months, a laundress at a hotel in Columbus. She was not running away. She needed people who understood that, even if she couldn't quite explain it. She was running toward. The difference mattered, even if the running looked the same from the outside. The Whitaker Ranch appeared around a bend in the road, and Evelyn's first thought was, it's worse than I expected. Not the land. The land was fine, a wide, level spread with mountain views that in better times must have looked like something from a painting. But the house, the fences, the general air of a place that had been tended carefully once and then abandoned to its own slow deterioration. 2 of the fence posts along the main line were leaning at angles that suggested they'd been that way long enough to accept their leaning as a permanent state. The garden bed beside the front porch had gone to weeds. A section of the porch railing had been replaced at some point with a rough-cut board that didn't match the rest, and whoever had cut it hadn't bothered to sand the edges. None of this was catastrophic. All of it was the particular kind of neglect that came not from laziness, but from grief. From a household that had lost the person who noticed these things and cared about them and kept after them. Evelyn had seen this before. She recognized it. Hector pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and stopped without ceremony. Here you are, he said, in the tone of a man completing a task he'd been assigned. She climbed down before he could not offer to help her. The front door of the house opened, and 3 children appeared in the doorway, standing in a close cluster the way children do when they're uncertain, not hiding exactly, but not coming forward either. The oldest was a girl of maybe 12, with serious eyes and a posture that spoke of someone who had learned too early to hold things together. The middle child was a boy, 7 or 8, thin-faced and quiet, with the particular quiet of someone who has chosen silence as a strategy. The youngest was a little girl of about 5, who was clutching the older girl's hand with both of hers and staring at Evelyn with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to disguise her curiosity. "Hello?" Evelyn said. The oldest girl said, "Hello." Her voice was careful. "I'm Evelyn Mercer. I've come from Ohio." "We know," the girl said. "Papa told us you were coming." A pause. "I'm Mara. This is Jonah. And this is Elsie." Jonah said nothing. Elsie stared. "Is your father home?" Something moved across Mara's face. Not quite discomfort, but something in that family. "He's out in the barn. He said to tell you to wait in the kitchen when you got here." Evelyn looked at the girl for a moment. 12 years old, managing the household, handling the arrival of a stranger her father had sent for. She thought, what has this child been carrying? She said, "Thank you, Mara. Can you show me where the kitchen is?" The kitchen was large and cold and bore the same signs as the rest of the house, a space that had once been cared for and wasn't anymore. The cast iron stove needed blacking. The floor needed sweeping. There was a pot on the back burner that had something dried in the bottom of it that had been there long enough to cement itself. Dishes on the shelf were stacked clean but not straight, the way someone who is tired stacks things. Evelyn set her bag down by the door. She did not sit and wait the way she'd been told. She found the broom. She was halfway through sweeping the floor when the back door opened and Caleb Whitaker came in from the barn. He was not what she'd pictured from the advertisement. She wasn't sure what she had pictured exactly. Something generic, probably. Some composite frontierman assembled from the limited evidence of a 6-line newspaper notice. The man who came through the back door was around 40, broad in the shoulders, with the kind of face that might have been open and easy once, and had since been drawn tight by whatever 3 years of grief and hard winters and a struggling ranch did to a face. He had good hands. She noticed this immediately, without knowing quite why. Large and weathered and careful. He stopped when he saw her sweeping. She stopped sweeping. They looked at each other for a moment that lasted a beat longer than was entirely comfortable. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Whitaker." He looked at the broom. "I told Mara to tell you to wait." "I heard. I don't do well with waiting." Something moved across his face that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of amusement. It didn't develop. He pulled off his hat and held it in his hands, which she recognized as a man performing the ritual of courtesy when he wasn't entirely sure how to feel about a situation. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "I'm 32. The advertisement said capable. It didn't say young." "I didn't write the advertisement, Mr. Whitaker." "You did." A pause. "Fair point." He moved to the table and pulled out a chair, gesturing for her to sit. She finished her sweep to the edge of the floor and leaned the broom against the wall before she sat. He sat across from her. He looked tired. Not just the tired that came from a long day of physical work, but the other kind. The kind that sleep didn't fix. "I'll tell you straight," he said. "I've had 2 women out here since Clara passed. First one lasted 6 weeks before she said the winters were too hard and went back to her sister in Denver. Second one lasted 4 months before she and my daughter decided they couldn't stand each other." He set his hat on the table. "I need someone who's going to stay." "I intend to stay." "That's what the first one said." "I'm not the first one, Mr. Whitaker." He looked at her steadily. "What made you answer an advertisement for a ranch in Montana? Woman your age, no disrespect intended, you could find something closer to home." She'd prepared for this question. She'd thought about what to say on the train, running through versions of the answer. Now sitting across from him in the cold kitchen with the broom still propped against the wall, and the children somewhere in the other room doing something very quiet, she found that all the prepared versions fell away. "I needed work that mattered," she said, "the kind that's visible at the end of the day. I'm a practical person, Mr. Whitaker. I'd rather fix something broken than tend something that doesn't need tending." He looked at her for a long moment. "Ranch is definitely broken," he said. "I noticed." He showed her the room she'd be using, a small space off the back of the house, originally a pantry that had been converted with a cot, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It was the cleanest room in the house, which suggested Mara had prepared it, which suggested the 12-year-old girl had been thinking about this woman's arrival in ways that her father probably hadn't considered. Caleb showed her the room and then stood in the doorway while she looked at it, clearly uncertain of the etiquette of the situation, of what exactly you said to a woman who had come from Ohio to live in your converted pantry and manage your fallen-apart household. He settled on, "Supper's at 6. The children eat together. I usually eat after." He paused. "Claire used to say it was better if we all ate together, but He stopped. "Whatever works best," Evelyn said, simply, not pushing. He looked at her like he was waiting for her to do something, to ask about Clara, or to say something sentimental, or to try to bridge the distance. She didn't do any of those things. She just began unpacking her bag in the matter-of-fact way of someone settling into a space they intend to occupy for a while. He left her to it. She found the children in the front room. Mara was sitting at a table attempting to do something with a piece of mending that had gotten beyond her skill level. Jonah was in the corner with a book open on his knees, though Evelyn noticed he hadn't turned a page since she'd come in. Elsie was on the floor with a rag doll that had one button eye and one stitched-on substitute for the eye that had been lost. "That mending's giving you trouble," Evelyn said to Mara. Mara looked up. "I can manage." "I know you can. I'm offering to help, not to take it away from you." A beat. Mara held out the fabric. A man's shirt with a tear at the shoulder seam that had gotten bigger before anyone caught it. Evelyn sat down, looked at the tear, and reached into her bag for the small sewing kit she kept there. "Your mother taught you to sew?" Evelyn asked. Mara's face went careful. "Some." "She teach you this particular stitch?" Evelyn showed her the technique for closing a seam from the inside. "No." "It's useful. Works better on heavier fabric, less likely to pull." She began working, slowly enough that Mara could watch. "You don't have to watch if you don't want to." Mara watched. Elsie, from the floor, said, "Can you fix Dorothy's eye?" Evelyn looked at the rag doll. The substitute eye was a button that didn't match, smaller than the original had been, clearly a repair made in haste by someone who wasn't much of a seamstress. "I can try." "What happened to her first eye?" "Fell off. Papa said he'd fix it, but he didn't." Not accusation in that small voice, just fact. The matter-of-fact accounting of a 5-year-old who had learned that some things got promised and didn't happen, and had simply filed that information away without much drama. Evelyn held out her hand. Elsie brought Dorothy over and put her in Evelyn's palm with the solemnity of someone handing over something valuable. Evelyn examined the remaining button, rooted in her sewing kit, and found a match close enough to satisfy. Jonah turned a page of his book. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't looked up, not directly. But something in the set of his shoulders had shifted, very slightly, in the way that a body shifts when it's paying close attention to something it's pretending not to care about. Supper at 6 was beans with salt pork and cornbread that Mara had made herself, with modest competence and no particular joy. Evelyn helped her finish the cornbread without making a production of it, and set the table without being asked. Caleb came in at 6:05. He looked at the table, at the set plates, at the filled water glasses, at the cornbread already cut and in a cloth. And then he looked at Evelyn, and she kept her expression neutral because she understood that he didn't need to be made to feel surveyed. They ate. The children were quiet in the particular way of children who had learned that meals were not occasions for noise. Evelyn didn't try to fill the silence with chatter. She asked Mara how old she was. She asked Elsie if Dorothy's new eye was satisfactory. She asked Jonah, gently, without pressing, if he liked the book he was reading. Jonah looked at her. He had his father's eyes, that same quality of having been open once and then cautiously drawn in. He said nothing. She didn't push. She looked back at her plate and said, to no one in particular, "The cornbread's good. Good rise on it. You used the right amount of leavening." Mara said, "I had to guess. The recipe book got water damaged. Next time, I'll show you how to do it by feel. After a while, you don't need the measurement." Mara looked at her, really looked at her, for probably the first time. Something in that look said, "You're planning on being here for a next time." What? After supper, Caleb found her on the porch, looking out at the last of the light on the mountains. "Children seem to have taken to you," he said. Careful phrasing. Not a compliment exactly. An observation. It's only the first evening. Mara doesn't usually talk to people. She talked because she wanted to, not because I made her. Evelyn paused. She's been carrying a lot, that girl. Something moved through Caleb's face. It wasn't offense, but it was adjacent to something uncomfortable. She manages. I know she manages. She's very capable. A beat. She shouldn't have to be quite so capable at 12. The silence between them was the kind that could go several directions. Evelyn waited to see which direction Caleb chose. He said, "You're blunter than I expected." "You asked for capable," she said. "Capable and blunt tend to travel together." He almost smiled. It didn't arrive, but it was close. He looked out at the mountains the way people look at landscapes when they're thinking about something they're not ready to say. "You'll want to know about the finances," he said finally. "Yes." "They're not good. I won't lie to you about that." He set his hands on the porch railing. "Clara managed the household accounts, and I let her because she was better at it than I was. When she died, I found out we were in worse shape than I knew." He said this without self-pity, which she appreciated. Self-pity was a thing that could sink a person, and she could see he'd already been very close to sinking. "I've been trying to pull it back, but the last 2 seasons were bad. If this winter's bad too..." "What's the most immediate problem?" Evelyn asked. "Not the largest. The most immediate." He looked at her. "Livestock. 3 of the cattle are showing signs of illness. If I lose them, I lose the income I was counting on for spring. And I don't have the knowledge to..." He stopped. "To treat them. Clara grew up on a farm. She knew things about animals I never learned." He said it simply, without embarrassment, but she could hear what it cost him. The admission of a gap his wife had filled that he'd never thought to learn himself because she'd always been there. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," Evelyn said. "Not cattle specifically, but I know something about livestock sickness. I can look at them tomorrow, if you like." He turned to look at her. In the fading light, his face was hard to read, but she caught the flicker of something. Not gratitude exactly, and not hope exactly, but the very early version of something that might become those things. "All right," he said. She nodded. "What time do you start in the morning?" 4:30. "I'll be up at 4, she said, and went inside. Bull. She lay on the cot in the converted pantry and stared at the ceiling and thought about the children, about Mara's careful eyes and Jonah's chosen silence, and little Elsie holding her doll with the mismatched button eye. About the way the kitchen had smelled of neglect. About Caleb Whitaker's hands on the porch railing and the particular quality of exhaustion in his voice when he talked about his wife. She'd known, in a general way, from the advertisement, that the situation would be difficult. What she hadn't known, couldn't have known from 6 lines in a newspaper, was the specific texture of the difficulty. It wasn't dramatically broken, this family. It wasn't violent or chaotic or obviously desperate. It was broken in the quieter way, the way that was almost harder to address because it didn't announce itself. It was a family that had learned to function around a wound without anyone admitting the wound was still there. She thought about Margaret Hollis on the train platform and the sound of her voice, plain as a fence post. And she let herself feel it for a moment, the sting of it, the particular exhaustion of being assessed by someone who had decided everything they needed to know before you'd opened your mouth. Then she set it aside. She had work to do. At 4 in the morning, she was in the kitchen, heating water. At 4:15, Caleb came in from his room and stopped in the doorway when he saw her. "You're up," he said. "I said I would be." He looked at the kettle on the stove. "I usually just—" "There's coffee," she said, "and I found a heel of bread that wasn't too far gone. It's not much, but it's something before you go out." He stood there for a moment with that expression, the one she was already starting to recognize, where he didn't quite know what to do with something unexpected. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. She poured the coffee and set the bread in front of him without ceremony. He ate. She stood at the window with her own cup, looking out at the darkness over the mountains. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Not ungrateful, just honest. I know. Your job is the house and the children, not my breakfast." "My job is to make this household function," she said, still looking out the window. "A ranch can't function if the person running it is running on empty." A pause. "You look like you haven't eaten a proper breakfast in about 6 months." He said nothing. She turned to look at him. "Am I wrong?" He picked up his coffee. "No," he said. "You're not wrong." The sick cattle were in a separate pen from the rest of the herd. Caleb had done that right, she noted, had isolated them without knowing exactly what he was dealing with. She crouched in the pen in the early morning dark, her lantern held close, and examined the nearest animal with the particular attention of someone who had grown up watching her father do this. Caleb stood outside the pen and watched her. "The discoloration around the eyes," she said without looking up. "You're feeding them from the creek pasture?" "Yes." "Is there standing water in the low section after the rain last month?" A pause. "Might be." "That's your problem." She stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "Lungworm, most likely, comes from wet ground, infected snails in the standing water. Not a death sentence if you catch it and keep them off that pasture." She looked at the animal's nose. "When did they start showing symptoms?" 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. "You have time. You'll need to—" She thought through what she remembered. "Turpentine drenching. My father used it. It's hard on them, but it works. And you need to drain that low section or fence them off from it completely." He looked at her steadily. "You know this from Ohio." "My father had cattle. And hogs. And before he had those, he had opinions about everyone else's cattle and hogs." She felt the small, involuntary pull of something like affection for her father, the man who had been difficult and demanding and had also taught her more about the practical business of staying alive than anyone else she'd ever known. "Not everything that's useful comes from formal education, Mr. Whitaker." "I'm starting to understand that," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement she'd received since stepping off the train, and she found she didn't need it to be more than it was. She handed him back his lantern, and they walked together back toward the house, and the sky over the mountains had begun to go pale at the edge. That particular gray-violet of very early morning that was neither night nor day, and she thought, this is a hard place. This is going to be harder than I thought. And then she thought, good. Because easy things had never been the things that changed anything. Easy things were something you passed through on your way to something real. And Evelyn Mercer had traveled 2 days by train and spent her last $31 and left her mother's worried face behind for something real. She intended to find it. The first week was a series of small battles, none of them dramatic, all of them exhausting in the way that constant vigilance is exhausting. She discovered that the root cellar was improperly ventilated and half the winter stores were developing mold. She spent 2 days addressing that, hauling out what was salvageable, improving the airflow, reorganizing what remained. Caleb watched her work without offering to help, which irritated her and which she didn't show. because she understood that he was still deciding whether she was going to stay and had therefore not yet committed to the investment of working alongside her. She discovered that Jonah had not spoken, not a word, not to anyone, since his mother's death 14 months ago. Mara told her this in the matter-of-fact tone of a child reporting a known fact about the weather. He stopped after Mama died. Papa took him to the doctor in town, and the doctor said, "Give him time." Mara paused. "That was a year ago." Evelyn said, "Does he write?" Mara looked at her. "What? Can he write? Does he know his letters?" "Yes. He was good at school before he stopped going." Evelyn thought about this. "All right," she said. She did not push Jonah. She did not look at him with the particular intensity of someone trying to fix something. She simply included him, set a place for him at the table, and talked around him the way you talk around someone who is present and listening even if they're not participating. She asked questions that didn't require him to answer, and sometimes she answered them herself in ways that left room for him to contradict her if he felt like it. She put a pencil and a small notebook on the corner of the table where he usually sat. She didn't explain why. She just put it there. 3 days later, she came into the kitchen and found that the notebook had been moved. Just slightly, just enough to tell her that someone had picked it up. Elsie attached herself to Evelyn on the 3rd day with the sudden, uncomplicated decisiveness of a 5-year-old who has identified what she needs. It happened over Dorothy's eye. Elsie had decided that since Evelyn had fixed Dorothy's eye, Dorothy now preferred to spend time near Evelyn, and therefore Elsie preferred to spend time near Evelyn, and this logic was, as far as Elsie was concerned, airtight. She followed Evelyn through the house asking questions. What was that? Why were you doing that? What did that smell mean? What was Evelyn's mother's name? Did Evelyn have a doll when she was little? What was the doll's name? Where was the doll now? Evelyn answered everything, directly and without talking down, because she had noticed that children who were talked down to developed a sixth sense for it and resented it bitterly. Elsie was not a child who could be put off with vague answers. She wanted the actual answer. What was your doll's name? I didn't have a doll. Elsie stared at this. It was clearly incomprehensible to her. You didn't have any doll? My family didn't have much money when I was young. My mother made me a corn husk doll when I was about your age, but it fell apart pretty quickly. That's sad. A little, Evelyn agreed. But I had a cat instead. Her name was Buttons. Why Buttons? Because she had a spot on her nose that looked like a button. Elsie considered this seriously. Dorothy's eye looks like a button, she offered. It does. Maybe Dorothy is like Buttons. Maybe she is. Elsie appeared satisfied by this and went back to playing on the floor, and Evelyn went back to the stove, and she thought, this is a good child. A child who had lost her mother at 4 and was still curious about the world, still interested in finding the connections between things. That wasn't nothing. That was remarkable, actually. The trouble with Caleb came at the end of the first week, and it came from the direction she'd half expected. She had reorganized the kitchen, not dramatically, not throwing things out or rearranging everything, but enough to make it functional in ways it hadn't been. She'd moved the flour to a higher shelf to keep it dry. She'd found a clay crock that was better for keeping butter and moved it to the window where the temperature was more consistent. Small things. Caleb came in on a Friday evening and stood in the kitchen doorway, and she could see immediately that something had gone tight in him. Clara kept the flour on the lower shelf, he said. She looked at him. She thought very carefully about what she was going to say. The lower shelf gets more moisture from the cooking, she said. You've been losing more flour than you should to clumping. The higher shelf... She kept it on the lower shelf, he said again. Not loud, not aggressive, but with a quality beneath the words that she understood. She set down what she was doing. She turned to look at him. Mr. Whitaker, she said, carefully. I'm not trying to erase what was here before. I'm trying to make what's here now work better. She let that sit. I can move it back if you want, but the flour will keep clumping. He looked at the shelf. He looked at the floor. Leave it, he said finally. Quiet and rough, like something that cost something. He went back out the door. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands still and her chest tight with something she wouldn't have been able to name precisely. Not quite sadness, not quite frustration, but something in the neighborhood of both. This was the thing that no one prepared you for. Not the hard work or the cold or the loneliness or even the judgment of women on train platforms. The, the grief of other people, which had its own logic and its own timeline, and which you couldn't argue with, no matter how clearly you could see the practical sense of what you were trying to do. She moved the flour back to the lower shelf. She'd find another way to keep it dry. Mara found her that night in the pantry room, sitting on the edge of the cot and going through the household account book that Caleb had left on the kitchen table for her to review. The numbers were not good. She'd known they wouldn't be. "Can I come in?" Mara asked. "Yes." The girl stood in the doorway. She'd put her hair in a braid for the night, and she looked in that moment younger than she did during the day. Younger and more uncertain and more clearly like someone who was carrying a thing she'd been carrying alone for a while. "He moved the flour back," Mara said. "I know. He does that. When things get moved, he—" She stopped, chose her words with a care that was painful to watch in a 12-year-old. "He doesn't mean it to be rude, he just—" "I know," Evelyn said again. "I understand, Mara. I really do." The girl looked at her. "You're not going to leave, are you? Because they did. The other two. After Papa got—" She stopped again. Evelyn thought about Margaret Hollis on the platform and the cold train ride and the $31 and the worn leather bag. She thought about what she'd said to herself in the dark. "Good. This is going to be harder than I thought. Good." "I'm not leaving," she said. Mara stood there for another moment, like she was testing the weight of those words, checking whether they were the kind that held or the kind that dissolved when pressure was applied. Then she said, "Good night, Miss Mercer." "Good night, Mara." She listened to the girl's footsteps go down the hall, and then she turned back to the account book, and she sat there in the cold pantry with the lamp burning low, and she added up the numbers again, and they still weren't good, and she thought, all right then, we start from here. Because that was the other thing that no one told you about starting over in a broken place. You didn't start from where you wanted to be. You didn't start from where it would have been reasonable to start. You started from exactly where the thing was. From the cracked foundations, and the infected cattle, and the flour shelf, and the grief that rearranged itself into small household confrontations because it had nowhere else to go. You started from here. And you went forward, one morning at a time. The second week started with a disagreement about the garden. It wasn't the first disagreement, and it wasn't the last. But it was the one that set the pattern for how Evelyn and Caleb Whitaker were going to manage the business of sharing a household without actually agreeing on very much. The garden bed along the south side of the house had gone entirely to dead stalks and weeds, the remnants of whatever Clara had planted the spring before she got sick. Evelyn had spent 3 mornings clearing it, working methodically through the frost-hard ground, pulling up what was dead and turning the soil over to see what was still viable underneath. Caleb came around the corner of the house on a Thursday morning and found her there. He stopped. He looked at the cleared ground. "What are you doing?" he said. "Preparing the bed for spring." She didn't look up. The soil was dense with clay and her arms were already aching. "If I get it turned now before the ground freezes solid, it'll be ready to plant in March. Otherwise you lose another season." Clara's roses were in there. She stopped. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Mr. Whitaker, the roses died 2 winters ago, by the look of the roots. There's nothing left to save." He looked at the bare ground. His jaw moved like he was going to say something and then thought better of it. "She planted them the first spring we were here," he said. He didn't say it as an argument. He said it the way people say things they need to have heard, regardless of whether anything can be done about them. Evelyn looked at the ground. She thought about what was practical and what was kind, and whether those two things had to be different things. "I can plant new ones," she said. "Not the same, but roses come back. If I get the right rootstock in spring." "It's not the same." "No," she said. "It's not." She met his eyes. "Nothing's going to be the same, Mr. Whitaker. That's not something I can fix. But the ground can grow again, if we let it." He stood there for another moment. Then he turned and went back toward the barn without answering, which she was beginning to understand was its own kind of answer. Not agreement, but not refusal either. The absence of an argument was the closest thing to permission she was going to get, and she'd learned to take it. She went back to turning the soil. Jonah wrote something in the notebook on a Tuesday. Evelyn didn't know it had happened until Mara came to find her in the afternoon. her face doing a complicated thing that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite managing it. "Jonah left something on the table," she said. Evelyn dried her hands and went to look. The notebook was open on the corner of the table where it always sat. In the center of the page, in careful, slightly uncertain handwriting that looked like someone who hadn't held a pencil in a while, were 4 words. "The soup was good." She stood there and looked at those 4 words for longer than she'd expected to. The soup had been a simple thing, salt pork and turnips, nothing remarkable. The kind of thing you made when the stores were getting low and you needed to stretch what you had. She'd made it 2 days ago and served it without comment, and Jonah had eaten 2 bowls without looking at anyone. She picked up the pencil that she'd left beside the notebook. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote, "Turnips are better than people give them credit for." She set the pencil back and walked away without making anything of it, because the thing about Jonah was that any direct attention made him retreat like a creature that had learned to associate notice with danger. Whatever was going to happen with that boy was going to happen sideways, in the margins, in the space where no one was looking directly at him. The next morning, the notebook had moved again. She didn't check what was written. She waited until she was alone in the kitchen, and then she looked. Under her sentence, in that same careful handwriting, "My mother didn't like turnips." She stood there with the sentence in her eyes, the weight of it, the past tense, the simple declarative, the fact that he'd written his mother into a sentence about soup, pressed on her chest in a way she hadn't expected. She picked up the pencil. Mine didn't either. She said they tasted like the ground they came from. A pause, and then, "I think that's actually a compliment." She closed the notebook and went to start breakfast. It was Mara who told her about the men from the bank. She said it in the way Mara said most things, without drama, in the precise economical tone of someone who had learned that drama required energy, and energy was a resource not to be wasted. "There were men here last spring," she said. They were working together in the kitchen, Mara shelling dried beans while Evelyn mended a tear in Caleb's winter coat. 2 of them, from the bank in Harlan Creek. They brought papers for Papa to look at. Evelyn kept her eyes on her work. "What kind of papers?" "I don't know exactly. Papa made me take Elsie outside." A pause. "But I heard some of it through the window." Another pause, longer. "They said something about a notice, about the mortgage, about if things didn't—" "I couldn't hear all of it." Mara's hands had slowed on the beans without her seeming to notice. "Papa didn't tell us anything after. He just said everything was fine." Evelyn considered what she'd seen in the account book, the numbers she'd added and re-added in the lamplight, the gap between what the ranch brought in and what it owed. "How long ago in spring?" she asked. "May, right before the last snowmelt. 6 months ago." Which meant whatever the bank had said in May was still sitting in the air over this household, unspoken, filed under the category of things Caleb Whitaker protected his children from knowing at the cost of dealing with them himself. "All right," Evelyn said. Mara looked at her. "All right, what?" "I just mean—" "All right, thank you for telling me." She kept her voice even. "You did the right thing." Mara went back to the beans. After a moment, she said, "Are we going to lose the ranch?" Evelyn set down the coat. She looked at the girl, at the 12-year-old who was asking a 12-year-old question in a 40-year-old voice, who had been managing her fear so quietly for so long that it had started to look like composure. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm going to find out. Papa doesn't like to talk about it." "I know." She picked up the coat again. "I'll handle it." Mara said nothing, but she shelled the rest of the beans faster, and Evelyn understood that as a kind of trust, the kind that didn't announce itself. She brought it up with Caleb on a Friday evening after the children were in bed. She didn't approach it carefully. She'd thought about how to approach it carefully and decided that careful was the wrong tool here. Caleb Whitaker's defenses were built exactly for careful, for the gentle approach, for the well-meaning suggestion offered at an angle. He'd been deflecting careful for a year and a half. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table where he was going through some papers of his own, and she said, "Tell me about the bank." He went very still. "Mara overheard something," she said last spring. "I'm not asking her to apologize for that. She's a child, and children overhear things, and then they carry them alone because nobody talks to them." She kept her voice even. "I'd rather you tell me directly than have Mara carrying it." He looked at her. His hands had stopped on the papers. It's my business, he said. I know it's your business. I'm not pretending otherwise. She folded her hands on the table. But I'm trying to help you run this household. I can't do that well if I don't know what I'm working against. The silence went on long enough that she thought he was going to refuse. He had that quality sometimes, that ability to simply not respond to a thing, to let it sit there unacknowledged until the person who'd said it began to feel uncertain about whether they'd said it at all. Then he set the papers down. The mortgage on this land, he said. Clara's father left it to me when he died, but there was an outstanding loan against it that I didn't know the full amount of until after Clara passed. He said this without accusation, which she noted. Not blaming Clara. Not blaming anyone. Just the facts. The note's due in full in the spring, March 15th. He looked at the table. I can't pay it. How much short are you? He told her. She didn't react to the number, though it was worse than she'd estimated. What did the bankmen say in May? They gave me until spring. After that, he stopped. They take the land. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet around them, that particular frontier quiet that was never entirely silent. The wind finding the gaps in the house, the stove settling, some animal outside doing whatever it did at this hour. What are the options? She asked. He looked at her like the question itself was slightly absurd. I've been trying to figure that out for 6 months. I know, 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. She picked up the account book, which she'd brought to the table. The cattle. If the sick ones recover, and I think they will, you have a viable herd to sell in spring. What's the price per head in Harlan Creek right now? He told her. She did the arithmetic in the margin of the account book. She showed him the number. That covers about 1/3 of what you need, she said. What about the north field? It's been fallow. Could you winter wheat it if you got seed in the ground in the next 2 weeks? He stared at her. The ground's almost frozen. Almost. Not quite. I looked at it this morning. She'd been looking at it for a week, actually, turning the question of that field over in her mind. If you got 3 men working it this weekend, do you have 3 men you could call? Hector. Maybe Simmons from the next spread over if I asked. If you planted now, you'd have a winter wheat crop coming in by April. It's not a guaranteed yield in this climate, but it's better than leaving it fallow another year. She looked at the numbers. That and the cattle gets you closer. Closer isn't enough. No, she agreed, but closer is better than where you are, and where you are isn't where we have to stay. She looked at him. There's also the question of what I'm doing here. He frowned. What? My wages. She said it plainly. You're paying me every month out of a budget that doesn't have room for it. I want to propose something different. She'd thought about this carefully, over several nights in the lamp-lit pantry. Don't pay me until spring. Whatever my wages would have been, keep it in the household account and use it toward the note. A pause. And in exchange, I want... She stopped. What? His voice had changed. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. I want to know what's happening with this ranch, fully, not reports after the fact. I want to be involved in the decisions. He was quiet for a moment. You're talking about a partnership. I'm talking about being treated like someone who has a stake in what happens here, she said. Which I do, whether either of us likes it or not. If this ranch goes under in March, I don't have a situation to go back to, so I have a stake. Another silence, longer this time. You'd give up 6 months of wages, he said. I have $31 in room and board. There's not much to give up. She said it without self-pity, just the arithmetic of it. But I can keep the books properly and find ways to reduce what we're spending and help you get the most out of what you have between now and March. That's worth more than my wages. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She didn't fill the silence. All right, he said. It was the same thing he'd said about the cattle, about the flower shelf, about a dozen small concessions over the past 2 weeks. But it felt different this time, less reluctant, more like someone choosing something rather than someone being maneuvered into it. She opened the account book to a clean page and wrote the date at the top. They worked at the kitchen table until nearly midnight. The wheat seed came from a man named Abe Coulter, who ran the grain operation on the far side of Harlan Creek. Evelyn had gone into town with Caleb on a Wednesday to see about supplies. and she'd spent 20 minutes in Coulter's shop asking questions about winter varieties and germination rates in this altitude, while Caleb stood slightly behind her and watched the transaction with an expression of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew about the situation. Coulter was a heavy-set, deliberate man with the kind of genuine interest in his subject that people develop when they've spent 30 years caring about something very specific. He answered her questions without condescension, which she appreciated, and he threw in an extra half-bushel of seed on account of Caleb's trouble, which she appreciated more. In the wagon on the way back, Caleb said, "How do you know so much about grain?" "My father grew winter wheat when I was young, before he switched to cattle." She was watching the road. "He made me learn every aspect of it, said knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you." "Smart man." "He was difficult," she said. "He was also smart. Both things were true at the same time." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, "Clara's father was like that." She waited. "Smart and difficult. He built this land from nothing, started with 40 acres and a mule and a temper that would stop a train." A pause. "He didn't think I was good enough for her, said so to my face." He said this without rancor, with something more complicated than rancor, something that had had time to settle into a shape that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite pride. "I spent 15 years trying to prove him wrong." "Did you?" "He came around eventually." A beat. Took him 10 years, but he came around. She looked at him sideways. The afternoon light was hitting the mountain peaks and coming back changed, softer, more golden. And he was looking at the road with that expression she'd started to be able to read, the one that meant he was somewhere else, some earlier time, some version of himself that still had more options than the current one. "He'd be angry about the state of the North Field," Caleb said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I suspect he would. The wheat was his idea originally. He always said that Field had the right drainage for it." A pause. "I never got around to doing it when he was alive. And then Clara—" He stopped, started again. "And then I stopped getting around to much." She understood this, the way grief interrupted the normal forward motion of a life, so that the things that hadn't been done yet became entangled with the loss and stayed undone, because doing them felt like moving away from something you weren't ready to move away from. "You're getting around to it now," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the road. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I am." Bassem. The town of Harlan Creek had opinions about what was happening at the Whitaker Ranch, and those opinions were delivered through various channels, the primary one being Margaret Hollis, who seemed to operate as a kind of clearinghouse for community sentiment. Evelyn encountered Margaret for the second time at the dry goods store on the same Wednesday, while she was making her way through a supply list that she'd organized by priority. First the things they absolutely needed, then the things they needed soon, then the things that would have to wait. Margaret was there with a woman named Dora Sims, whose husband worked the neighboring spread. Dora Sims was different from Margaret, quieter, less certain of her own opinions, the kind of woman who stood slightly behind stronger personalities and took her emotional temperature from the room. Margaret said, "Miss Mercer, still here, I see." Evelyn set a sack of salt on this counter and looked at her. "Still here, Mrs. Hollis. I heard you've been making quite a few changes out at the Whitaker place." The tone was the particular kind of pleasant that wasn't pleasant. Moving things around. Some things needed moving. Clara Whitaker had a very particular way of running that household. Margaret glanced at Dora Sims, confirming she had an audience. She was well loved in this community, very respected. "I'm sure she was." Evelyn turned back to the counter. "I'll take 2 yards of that flannel as well, the dark blue." "I wonder sometimes," Margaret continued, undeterred, "whether Caleb's in his right mind bringing a stranger in to manage his children and his home. A woman he knows nothing about." Evelyn counted out coins on the counter. "He knows I can work," she said. "That was the qualification he listed in the advertisement. I meet it." She picked up her purchases. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hollis, Mrs. Sims." She walked out the door. Behind her, she heard Margaret say something to Dora Sims, the particular murmur of someone providing commentary on an exit. She didn't stop. She walked to the wagon where Caleb was loading the grain sacks, and she set her parcels in the back without comment. He had seen, from across the street. She could tell by the way he looked at her. Not quite an apology in it, but an awareness. "Margaret Hollis," he said. She has opinions, Evelyn said. She always did. He settled the last sack. You should know, she and Clara were close. For a long time. I understand. She's not entirely wrong that people are watching. He said this carefully, not as a warning exactly, more as information. The way things are done here, people notice. People noticed me the moment I stepped off the train, Evelyn said. I'm used to being noticed. She climbed up onto the wagon. What I'm not used to is letting it change what I do. He stood on the ground beside the wagon and looked at her for a moment with that expression she couldn't always name, the one that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite respect, but lived somewhere near both of them. Then he climbed up and took the reins, and they headed back toward the ranch. The trouble with Jonah came suddenly, in the way that things that have been building quietly always arrive, all at once, louder than expected. It was a Sunday, 3 weeks after Evelyn's arrival. She'd been in the kitchen when she heard something break in the front room. She went through the door and found Jonah standing in the center of the room with a shattered clay pot at his feet and his hands shaking. Mara was in the corner, very still. Elsie was on the stairs with her eyes wide. Caleb appeared from the hallway. What happened? It was an accident, Mara said immediately, in the tone of someone covering. But Evelyn had been watching Jonah's face, and it hadn't been an accident. The pot had been on the table, Clara's pot, the one that sat in the center with a dried arrangement of flowers from summers ago. And something had happened that she'd missed, and Jonah had knocked it to the floor. On purpose. His face was doing something she hadn't seen from him before. Something that wasn't his usual contained quiet. His eyes were bright with something that was fighting to get out, and his jaw was clenched, and his hands, those still, contained hands, were still shaking. Caleb looked at the broken pot, and his own face went through something complicated. Jonah, he said, low, warning. Jonah looked at his father, and his jaw tightened further, and Evelyn saw it coming before it happened. The thing that was fighting to get out, finding a different outlet. Jonah picked up the clay pieces. He threw them at the wall. Not at anyone. At the wall with a precision that said this was about the wall, not about any person in the room. But the sound of it, the crash, the scatter of pieces, made Elsie cry out and made Mara press herself further into the corner. Caleb moved toward his son. Enough. Caleb, Evelyn said. He stopped, looked at her, something in her voice. She crossed the room and crouched in front of Jonah. He was 8 years old. He had been silent for 14 months. He was shaking so hard she could see it in his shoulders. She didn't touch him. She put herself at his level and she looked at him and she said quietly and directly, "You're angry." He stared at her. "It's all right," she said. "Being angry is all right." His chin trembled, just once. "I know," she said. She didn't say what she knew. She didn't name it. She just said those two words in a voice that she'd learned from her father. Not soft exactly, but steady. The voice of someone who wasn't going anywhere. And Jonah Whittaker, who hadn't spoken in 14 months, made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the sound that comes before words. The kind of sound that a person makes when the thing they've been holding stops fitting inside them. Something between a gasp and a sob. His whole body shook with it. Evelyn opened her arms and let him come to her if he was going to, and he did. Not gradually, not with the hesitation she might have expected, but all at once, the way someone falls when they've been holding themselves up for too long. She held him while he cried, the first sound he'd made in over a year. She looked up at Caleb, who was standing in the middle of the room with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not grief exactly, not relief exactly. Something too complicated for either of those words. Mara had come away from the corner. She was watching her brother with an expression that was its own kind of complicated, something between the release of long-held tension and the raw edge of her own grief, which she'd been managing so carefully for so long that watching it break open in someone else seemed to crack something in her too. Elsie had come down the stairs. She stood in the doorway with Dorothy clutched against her chest, watching Jonah with the serious attention of a 5-year-old who understands that something important is happening. Eventually, the crying slowed. Jonah stayed where he was, not moving away, his head against Evelyn's shoulder, his breathing gradually evening out. After a while, long enough that the room had gone quiet again, he said in a voice rough from disuse, "I miss her." The words were barely a sound, almost nothing, But they went through the room like something with weight. Caleb sat down on the nearest chair, just sat down, like his legs had decided without consulting him. He put his elbows on his knees and his hands over his face, and he stayed there. Evelyn said to Jonah quietly, "I know you do." He was still for a moment, then, "She used to sing when she was in the kitchen, in the morning." "What did she sing?" A long pause. "Old songs. I don't know the names." He pulled back slightly, not all the way, just enough to look at Evelyn with red-rimmed eyes. "You don't sing." "No," she said. "I don't sing. I'm terrible at it." A pause. "But if you tell me what the songs were, maybe Mara remembers the words." Mara from across the room said quietly, "I remember some of them." Jonah looked at his sister. Something passed between them, some sibling language that Evelyn couldn't translate and didn't need to. "Okay," he said. It was the second word he'd spoken, the first complete one. Caleb found Evelyn on the porch that evening, after the children were in bed. He came out and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while. The night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that came with altitude and season, when the sky was so full of stars it looked almost crowded. He said, "What you did with Jonah?" "You would have gotten there," she said. "I don't know if I would have." He said it without self-reproach, just honestly. "I didn't know how. I kept thinking if I just gave him time. The doctor said give him time, and I kept doing that." "Time by itself doesn't always do it," she said. "Sometimes it needs something to break it open." He was quiet. The pot was Clara's, from her grandmother. "I know." He knew that. He knew what it was. She thought about this. "I think that might be why it was the pot," she said. "Not something he didn't care about, something he did." A pause. "Grief does strange things to the way people choose." He looked at the sky. She looked at the sky. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she could feel their presence, the way you feel the presence of large things you can't see. "He spoke," Caleb said. "He did. First time since—" He stopped, swallowed. "Since February last year." "I heard." Another silence. "Thank you," he said. He said it like a man who didn't say the words often and was aware of their weight. "Don't thank me," she said. He found his way back. "I just stood there while he did it." Caleb looked at her sideways. "You do that a lot," he said. "Stand there while things happen." "It's an underrated skill," she said. Something moved across his face, not the almost smile from the kitchen that first night. Something that got a little further before it stopped. Something that reached his eyes, briefly. He went back inside. She stayed on the porch for a few more minutes, breathing the cold air, looking at the stars. By the end of October, the Northfield had been planted. It had taken Caleb and Hector Briggs and a neighbor named Simmons 2 full days of brutal work in ground that was in the process of deciding whether to freeze, and the result was not beautiful. There were sections where the seed hadn't gone in as deep as it should have, and one corner where the drainage was wrong and would need to be addressed come spring. But it was done. The sick cattle were responding. She'd worked with Caleb on the treatment for 3 weeks, checking on them every morning, adjusting as needed, and the animals were slowly returning to something like health. Not all of them. One of the 3 was too far gone and they'd lost her, which Caleb took hard in the quiet way he took everything hard, absorbing it inward without letting it surface. But 2 out of 3 was better than she'd feared when she first looked at them. She was keeping 2 sets of books now. The official account book and a working ledger she kept for herself, tracking expenditures against estimates, watching the numbers the way you watch the weather in country like this, always looking for what was coming before it arrived. Mara had started asking her questions about the ledger, at first just looking over her shoulder when Evelyn sat at the table with it, then asking what a particular entry meant, then gradually asking why she was calculating things the way she was, what the logic was behind the organization. "You're interested in numbers," Evelyn said one evening. Mara shrugged in the way 12-year-olds shrug when they don't want to seem too interested in something. "I'm all right at them." "Better than all right from what I've seen." Evelyn pushed the ledger toward her. "Show me how you'd organize this." Mara pulled the ledger toward herself and looked at it for a moment, Then she picked up the pencil and began reorganizing the columns with a confidence that was neither hasty nor hesitant. She had a good mind for it, a natural instinct for how numbers related to each other, for the patterns underneath the figures. Evelyn watched her work and felt something that she couldn't have named precisely, something that was partly the satisfaction of a teacher watching someone learn quickly, and partly something else, something quieter and more personal. This is what was waiting for this girl, she thought. Under all the managing and the grief and the responsibility, this is who she is. "Your mother teach you any of this?" she asked. Mara's hands paused. "Not the numbers. She taught me sewing and cooking and how to put up preserves." She was quiet for a moment. "Papa says she was good at managing the money, but she kept it in her head. Didn't write much down." "Some people work that way." Evelyn looked at the ledger. "Writing it down is better, in my experience. Keeps you honest about what's actually there versus what you remember being there." Mara nodded slowly. "Miss Mercer?" "Mara. Do you think we're going to be all right by spring?" She asked it carefully, like someone who had thought about asking for a while and had decided that asking was better than not knowing. Evelyn looked at the columns of figures. She thought about the cattle and the wheat and the wages she wasn't taking and the gap that still remained. She thought about the banknote and the date, March 15th. "I think we have a real chance," she said. And then, because Mara deserved honesty and not just comfort, "I'm not certain yet, but I think we have a real chance." Mara looked at the ledger. "What else can I do?" Evelyn looked at her, at this 12-year-old sitting straight in her chair with her pencil in her hand and her eyes serious and clear. And she thought, Caleb Whitaker doesn't know what he has in this daughter. He's too close to it, too caught in his own grief to see it yet. "You can keep helping me with this," she said. "That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot." Mara nodded. She pulled the ledger back and went on with what she was doing. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall. Not the threatening preliminary flurries they'd had earlier in the month, but the heavier, committed kind that said winter had stopped making suggestions and was now issuing instructions. It came down steady and serious past the kitchen window, filling in the ruts in the yard, softening the edges of the barn roof, covering the newly planted north field in a white blanket that would, if the season went the way Evelyn needed it to go, protect the seed through the coldest months and give it a chance to come up in the spring. She watched the snow for a moment. Then she turned back to the table and went to work. The snow that had started falling at the end of October didn't stop for 3 days. By the time it let up, the yard was buried past the bottom of the fence posts, and the path from the house to the barn had to be dug out twice daily, or it disappeared again. Caleb did the first digging at 4 in the morning, and Evelyn did the second in the afternoon, and neither of them discussed this arrangement. It simply organized itself out of necessity, the way most things on the ranch were beginning to organize themselves, through a kind of quiet negotiation that happened without either of them naming what they were doing. November arrived hard. The temperature dropped to places that made the air feel like something solid you were pushing through rather than breathing. The livestock needed extra feed and more frequent checking. The house needed constant attention to keep the cold from finding its way into the places where the insulation was thin. And there were several such places because the house, like everything else on the Whitaker Ranch, had been deferred past the point where deferring was smart. Evelyn found the worst gap above the back window of the pantry room where she slept, discovered it at 2 in the morning when the cold woke her with the specific insistence of air moving across her face in a space where air shouldn't be moving. She lay there for a moment, cataloging the sensation, the direction of it, the steadiness. And then she got up, lit the lamp, found the gap with her fingers, stuffed it temporarily with a piece of rag, and made a note in the working ledger about sealing it properly before the deep winter set in. She went back to sleep. It was the kind of thing she did not mention to Caleb, not because she was trying to hide it, but because it was simply a problem she'd identified and solved, and there was nothing to be gained from reporting it. But Mara, who had a 12-year-old's gift for knowing things that weren't announced, noticed the rag stuffed above the pantry window and said nothing about it either. She simply appeared one afternoon with a length of horsehair caulking compound that she'd found in the barn and left it on the windowsill with the matter-of-fact considerateness that was becoming one of the things Evelyn relied on without quite realizing how much shit. Jonah spoke more now. Not often. Not freely in the way children who haven't been through what he'd been through spoke, with the natural, unconsidered ease of someone who hasn't learned yet that words can be taken from you. He chose his words carefully, like a person spending a limited currency, and he tended to use them when he and Evelyn were doing something together, some task, some shared work, rather than in the open air of conversation where they'd have to stand on their own. He helped her in the kitchen sometimes, not consistently and not without signaling first, but when he felt like it, he'd appear at the edge of the room and begin doing something without being asked, and she'd work beside him and not make anything of it, and occasionally something would come out of that. A question about what she was doing, a comment about something he remembered, once a full 3-sentence account of a fishing trip he and his father had taken the summer before his mother died. She listened to that one carefully. The fish were this big, he said, his hand spread to a width that was probably generous by approximately 50%. Papa caught 4 and I caught 2, but mine were bigger. Did he argue about that? Yes. A pause. The ghost of something on his face that wasn't quite a smile but was pointing in that direction. He said his were bigger, but they weren't. Sounds like your father, she said, keeping her eyes on the pot she was stirring. Jonah was quiet for a moment. He used to laugh more, he said. She kept stirring. I know. Before Mama got sick. People change when they lose someone, she said. Sometimes they come back to themselves. Sometimes it takes a long time. She glanced at him. I think your father is trying. Jonah considered this with the solemnity he brought to most things. He smiles more since you came, he said. Not a compliment, not a statement with any particular shape to it. Just an observation, offered the way he offered most things, directly, without decoration. She looked at the pot. That's good, she said. He went back to what he was doing. She stayed at the stove and felt something move through her that she didn't examine too carefully, because examining it would have required her to name it, and naming it felt premature and possibly dangerous. The letter from Ohio came in the second week of November. It arrived with the weekly post that Hector Briggs picked up from town, and it had her mother's handwriting on the outside. That particular slightly slanted script she'd known her whole life, the one that still looked the way it had looked when she was 8 years old, and her mother was writing grocery lists and letters to the schoolhouse. She opened it in the pantry room, sitting on the cot with her coat still on because she'd just come in from checking the cattle and hadn't warmed up yet. Her mother's letters always began with weather. It was a conversational opening, a way of establishing proximity. Here is what it looks like where I am. And Evelyn had always found it both entirely ordinary and obscurely touching. 3 sentences about the Ohio weather. Then the news. Her Aunt Vera's hip had worsened. Her cousin Thomas had left his wife, which the letter treated with a careful neutrality that communicated very clearly that this was considered a significant failing. Her mother's friend Ruth had moved to Cincinnati to be near her daughter. And then, further down, your father's brother Edmund has written to say there is some business question about the farm. He wants someone from the family to come and sort it out. I don't understand the details, Evelyn, but he says it's important and that there's some kind of legal matter involved. I told him you were in Montana, and he said, well, I won't write exactly what he said about Montana, but he felt strongly that family matters should come before other arrangements. She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in the chest of drawers and went out to start supper. She didn't tell Caleb about it that evening. She helped Elsie with the mending that had accumulated over the week, listened to Jonah read aloud from his school book with the new, fragile confidence of someone who had found his voice again and was still testing its edges, and talked with Mara about the ledger entries from the past 2 weeks. It was only later, lying on the cot in the dark, that she let herself think about it properly. Edmund, her father's older brother, the one who had always treated her like an inconvenient footnote in the family's arrangements, who had not come to her father's funeral, who had sent a brief note when her mother had needed help 3 years ago and not followed it up with anything more concrete. Family matters important when those matters involved his own interests, and flexible when they involved anyone else's. She knew what some business question about the farm meant. It meant Edmund had decided he wanted something that he was going to frame as a family decision. She lay in the dark and she thought about Ohio, which she had left deliberately and not without cost. And she thought about this house and these children and the north field under snow and the account book with its careful columns and the banknote due March 15th. She thought about Jonah's voice, rough and careful, saying he smiles more since you came. She thought about what it would mean to leave. She put the thought away. There was nothing to decide yet. Edmund's letter had gone to her mother, not to her. There was no summons she was obligated to answer. Not yet. December came and the temperature dropped further, and the days shortened to the point where the light barely had time to get established before it started pulling back again. The household had found its rhythm, the way households do when the people in them stop fighting the shape of things and start moving with it. Evelyn was up at 4. Caleb went to the barn. The children woke at 6:30, and Mara managed their morning routine with a competence that Evelyn was slowly, carefully, systematically relieving her of, not by taking things away from her, but by doing more herself so that Mara was doing 12-year-old things rather than 35-year-old things. It was a subtle shift, but she could see it happening in Mara's face, the slight loosening, the occasional return of something that looked more like a child's expression than a household manager's. Elsie had appointed herself Evelyn's assistant in the kitchen and took this role with a seriousness that was frequently impractical and always charming. She had opinions about everything, about the arrangement of the vegetables, about which spoon was the right spoon for a given task, about the number of minutes that constituted sufficient stirring time. Evelyn worked around these opinions with the patience that came easily when the person holding the opinions was 5 and in deadly earnest about all of them. "More salt," Elsie said one morning, standing at Evelyn's elbow with her small face set in the expression of someone who had given the matter careful thought. "The soup is already salted. It needs more. If I add more salt, it'll be too salty." Elsie considered this. "Maybe a little more." "A little might be all right," Evelyn conceded, and allowed Elsie the satisfaction of adding a single careful pinch. Caleb, coming in from the morning's work to find his youngest daughter supervising the salt content of the soup, with the gravity of a judge issuing a ruling, stopped in the doorway and watched for a moment without either of them noticing. When Evelyn looked up and saw him, his face had the expression that Jonah had described. Not laughter, not quite, but the thing underneath laughter, the warm, preparatory state before it. "She's very particular about salt," Evelyn said. "She's very particular about everything," he said. He hung his coat and hat and moved to the stove to warm his hands, and Elsie immediately transferred her attention to her father, taking his hand and explaining the salt situation in case he had questions. He listened to her with the full attention he gave his children. One of the things Evelyn had noticed early and continued to notice, the way he listened to them, the complete quality of it, how he didn't manage their conversation from a distance, but came all the way into it. He was better with them than he knew, better than he gave himself credit for, in the long inventory of his failings that he seemed to be constantly compiling. "Papa," Elsie said, having completed the salt briefing, "Miss Mercer is going to plant roses in spring." Caleb looked at Evelyn. "Mara suggested it," Evelyn said, which was true. Mara had brought it up herself without prompting a few weeks back, had said, carefully, that she thought her mother would have wanted the garden to be a garden again rather than a bare patch. It had cost Mara something to say it. Evelyn had treated it with the gravity it deserved. "Good," Caleb said. He said it simply, without the complicated weight the garden had carried in October when she'd cleared the dead stalks. Just good. Something in him had shifted, in the way things shift during a long winter when the work continues and the world is quiet and there's time, whether you want it or not, to rearrange the things you carry. So, the crisis came on a Sunday night in the 3rd week of December, and like most crises, it announced itself with something small. Evelyn was in the pantry room when she heard Mara call for her. Not her usual voice, the careful managed voice of the household manager, but a different register entirely, the voice of someone who had abandoned management for urgency. She was in the hall before she'd consciously decided to move. Mara was at the door of Elsie's room. Her face was pale in a way that went beyond the cold. "She's burning up," Mara said. Evelyn went through the door. Elsie was in her bed with the quilts pulled up to her chin, and her face the color of something that had been left too long at a fire. That high, dry flush that Evelyn recognized from her childhood, from her father's farm, from the terrible winter when her youngest brother had gotten sick and her mother had sat at his bedside for 5 days without sleeping. She put her hand on Elsie's forehead. The heat was significant, not the warm but manageable heat of a mild fever, the kind that climbed. "How long?" she said to Mara. "She said she didn't feel well at supper. I thought—" Mara's voice had a crack in it. I thought it was just tired. You didn't do anything wrong. Evelyn said it fast and firm, because that particular guilt would immobilize Mara and she needed Mara functional. How long ago was supper? 3 hours. She turned to look at Elsie's face. The girl's eyes were open but glassy, focused on something that wasn't in the room. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Get your father, Evelyn said. Mara went. Evelyn stayed. She pulled the quilts down slightly and put her hand on Elsie's chest, feeling the breathing. Rapid, the lungs working harder than they should. She looked at the girl's lips. The color there. She checked her neck for swelling and found none, which was something. Elsie, she said, can you hear me? Not a word, just acknowledgement. I'm right here. I'm staying right here. Caleb came through the door with Mara behind him, and the look on his face, the look she caught in the fraction of a second before he reorganized it, was the look of a man walking back into a room he'd been in before, a room he'd sworn he wouldn't have to be in again. He moved to the bed and put his hand on Elsie's forehead and held it there, and the expression he was containing was so large and so badly contained that she could see it at the edges of him. How bad? He said. Quiet, controlled. The fever's high, she said. I need to know what you have in the house. Any willow bark? Bone set? Any medicine at all from the last time someone was sick here? Clara kept a tin. He was already moving. In the kitchen, above the stove. He went for it. She stayed with Elsie and kept talking to her, small things, inconsequential things, the kind of talk that wasn't about what was happening but was simply a voice, a presence, a signal that someone was there and paying attention. Mara appeared at her elbow. Tell me what to do, she said. This was what the girl was. Not someone who went to pieces, not someone who ran, but someone who asked what to do and then did it. Evelyn had known it from the beginning, but it arrived freshly every time. I need cold water, clean cold water and cloth, not freezing, cold from the pump, but not ice. And get Jonah up and keep him in the other room and don't let him in here yet. Mara went. Caleb came back with the tin. They went through it together. A few dried herbs, a small bottle of something that had mostly evaporated, a paper packet of white powder with a label that had gone illegible from moisture. She discarded that one immediately. There's a willow bark preparation in here, she said, finding it, dried bark in a cloth packet. We can make a tea from this. Not strong enough by itself, but it's something. Should I go to town? He said. Get the doctor. What's the road like tonight? He was silent for a beat. Bad, coming from the north this afternoon. If it's drifted the way I think it's drifted, you couldn't get through before morning, and if you went out in it... She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to. Both of them knew what the Montana wilderness in a December blizzard did to people who went into it alone and unprepared. Then what do we do? He said, and the question came out stripped of everything. No composure, no management, just the raw question of a man who had already lost one person in this house and was standing at the edge of losing another and needed someone to tell him what to do. She looked at him. She kept her voice steady. We bring the fever down, she said. We make the tea. We use the cool cloths. We keep her awake enough to drink. We watch her breathing. A pause. And we stay with her. All of it. One thing at a time. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face. Then he nodded and went to start the fire higher. The night was the longest Evelyn had spent since she'd arrived. They worked in shifts, not formally, not arranged, but by mutual instinct. When one of them moved to do something, the other covered the space they'd vacated. She made the willow bark tea and got a few swallows into Elsie with the patience of someone who had done this before and knew that patience was the only tool that worked when a child was half-conscious and not inclined to cooperate. Caleb held Elsie's head and spoke to her in a voice she hadn't heard him use before, low and rough, and entirely without the controlled quality he usually maintained, just his voice undisguised, saying her name and saying, I'm here, Elsie girl, I'm right here. Mara changed the cloths without being asked. Working on a rotation, she'd established herself, wringing them out and folding them and replacing them with a methodical competence that was both admirable and heartbreaking. Jonah, who they'd tried to keep in his room, appeared in the doorway at some point around midnight. He was wearing his coat over his nightclothes and his face was white and set. He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway and watched. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about sending him back, She decided against it. He stood there for 2 hours, watching, present, not speaking. Around 2 in the morning, the fever crested. She knew what a crest felt like, the moment when the body's fight reached its highest pitch before it either broke or broke the wrong way. Elsie's breathing changed, became more labored, and Caleb, who had been keeping himself together by sheer force for 6 hours, made a sound beside her that was almost nothing, almost completely suppressed, but she heard it. She kept working. "Talk to her," she said to Caleb. "Don't stop talking to her." He talked. She didn't listen to the words. They weren't for her. But the sound of his voice, continuous and low and full of the things he couldn't afford to feel, and was feeling anyway, was part of the work. She believed this, that the presence of people who loved you was something a fevered body could sense, something it registered below the level of consciousness, something that mattered. She worked with the cloths and the tea and the careful monitoring of Elsie's breathing and her color, and she watched for the signs she was watching for, and she told herself that the body knew how to fight, that it had been fighting since before there were people who knew how to help it, that her job was simply to support a process that was already happening. She told herself this. She wasn't entirely sure she believed it, but she kept going anyway, because the alternative to keeping going was not something she was willing to consider. At 4 in the morning, Elsie's breathing changed again, more gradual this time, the labored quality easing, not disappearing but retreating. The flush on her face shifted towards something less alarming. Evelyn put her hand on Elsie's forehead, and the heat was still present but different, the sharp, aggressive heat of the fever at its height, softening towards something that was still fever but was no longer climbing. She said quietly, "I think it's turning." Caleb was on the other side of the bed. He had been holding Elsie's hand for the past 2 hours without breaking the contact. He looked at Evelyn over his daughter's body, and his eyes were red and exhausted and something else. Something she looked at, and then looked away from because it was too direct. "You're sure?" he said. "Not completely, but her breathing is easier." She put her hand back. "I think it's turning." He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then he opened them and looked back at his daughter. Jonah had fallen asleep in the doorway, curled on the floor with his coat pulled around him. Mara was asleep in the chair in the corner, her cloth still in her hand. Evelyn left Caleb with Elsie and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window in the first gray dark of early morning, looking at nothing, her hands around the iron of the stove for warmth. She was shaking, she noticed. Not from cold, from the release of something she'd been holding very tightly for the past several hours. She pressed her palms flat against the stovetop until she felt the warmth travel up her wrists and into her arms, and she breathed deliberately, the way she'd learned to breathe in difficult situations. Not deeply, just steadily, just one breath following the other with regularity. Caleb came into the kitchen. She heard him. She didn't turn around. He stood behind her for a moment. Then he moved up beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold kitchen. And he put his hands on the stove next to hers and looked out the same window at the same gray pre-dawn nothing. "She's sleeping," he said. "Good. Normal sleeping, not—" He stopped, started again. "Her color's better." "Yes." A long silence. The kettle began to hiss. "I need you to know," he said. He stopped. She waited. He tried again. "What you did tonight, the way you— I've been watching you for 2 months. The way you work, the way you handle things. And tonight—" He stopped a third time, and she understood that he was not a man who said things like this often, and was therefore not particularly skilled at it. "You don't need to say it," she said. "I want to say it." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her, and his face was entirely without the management she'd become accustomed to, the controlled quality that he maintained as a default. He looked tired and scoured and more like himself than she'd seen him. "You fought for her," he said, "like she was yours." She held his gaze. "She is mine," she said, and then stopped, because that wasn't entirely the right word, and she knew it, and she could see that he knew it too. "I mean, she matters to me. They all do." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face. She turned back to the kettle. "The way you said that," he said quietly. "The way you said she matters to you." He paused. "I don't think you entirely knew how much until tonight." She took the kettle off the heat. She poured 2 cups because her hands needed something to do. She set one in front of him. "Sleep," she said. "I'll watch her through the morning." "I'm not going to sleep." "Then sit down at least." He sat. She sat across from him. They drank the tea in silence while the gray pre-dawn outside the window slowly, reluctantly, became morning. Elsie opened her eyes fully at 7:30. She was weak and vague, and her voice was barely there, but she opened her eyes and they focused on Evelyn's face, and she said, in a thread of sound, "Dorothy." "I'll get her," Evelyn said. She brought the doll. Elsie held it against her chest with the loose grip of someone who doesn't have full strength yet, and looked at Evelyn with eyes that were still glassy but present. "You stayed," Elsie said. "I stayed." Elsie blinked slowly. "All night?" "All night." She was quiet for a moment. "Papa too?" "Papa too." Something crossed Elsie's face. Young children have a particular kind of relief, not the adult version, which is retrospective and aware of what was at stake, but the simple immediate version, which is just the body learning that the thing it feared has passed. Elsie's face did that thing. Then she closed her eyes again and held Dorothy and slept. Evelyn sat beside her. Caleb appeared in the doorway and looked at his daughter sleeping and at Evelyn sitting beside her, and he stood there for a long moment without speaking. Mara appeared behind him. She looked past her father at Elsie's sleeping face, and something went through her, something that she controlled quickly, as she controlled most things, but not quickly enough that Evelyn missed it. The grief and relief braided together, the weight of having been the oldest, of having been awake when she should have been asleep, of having been watching and working and not knowing whether working would be enough. Jonah came to the doorway too. He looked at his sister. He was still wearing his coat. He said, "Is she okay?" First words of the morning. Addressed to no one specifically, just the question, standing in the air. "She's okay," Evelyn said. He nodded. He turned and went to his room without another word. Caleb was still standing in the doorway. Evelyn looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't try to read, not directly, because looking at it directly felt like looking at the sun. Not impossible, but requiring a kind of preparation that she wasn't sure she'd made. She looked back at Elsie. "The fever needs to be watched through today," she said. "If it comes back hard tonight, you'll need to go for the doctor regardless of the road." "I know," he said. "She'll need broth when she wakes. Small amounts, not too much at once." "I know," he said again, softer. She nodded and turned back to the girl. Caleb stayed in the doorway for another moment. Then he came into the room and sat on the other side of the bed, and they sat there together in the early morning quiet, the child between them sleeping, the storm outside finally running out of breath, the pale winter light coming through the window and landing on the quilt in a way that was almost gentle, almost warm. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. Everything that mattered in that moment was already present in the room, in the steady sound of Elsie's breathing, in the warmth the stove had finally gotten into the walls, in the particular quality of shared exhaustion that comes from people who have been through something together and come out on the other side of it still standing. The day outside the window was cold and white and entirely ordinary, which after a night like that was something very close to beautiful. Elsie recovered slowly, the way children recover from serious illness, in fits and starts, with good hours followed by hours that were less good, her energy returning in installments rather than all at once. For the first 3 days after the fever broke, she slept most of the time, waking to eat a little broth, and to check that Dorothy was still within arm's reach, and to confirm that Evelyn was somewhere in the house, which seemed to be the primary thing she needed to verify before she could go back to sleep. Evelyn would appear in the doorway and say, "Right here," and Elsie would close her eyes with the uncomplicated trust of a child who has been given exactly the answer she needed. The watching was not over. Fevers like that one had a way of breaking and returning, and Evelyn checked on Elsie through each night for the better part of a week, sleeping in a way that was more like a series of short vigils connected by brief unconsciousness than actual rest. She was tired in a way that settled into the joints and behind the eyes, the specific tiredness of sustained vigilance that doesn't allow itself to fully release. Caleb noticed. She knew he noticed because he started doing things around it without announcing them, making sure there was coffee ready when she came into the kitchen at odd hours, taking the outdoor tasks that required early rising so she could sleep until 5 instead of 4, once appearing silently in the doorway of Elsie's room at 2 in the morning when she was checking on the girl and simply nodding at her in a way that said, "Go rest, I have this." She'd shaken her head, and he'd come in anyway, and they'd both stayed until they were satisfied, and then they'd gone back to their separate rooms without a word, and somehow that was entirely sufficient. Something had shifted between them after the night of Elsie's fever. Neither of them named it or referred to it directly, in the way that significant things sometimes don't get named, because naming them would require both parties to acknowledge them, and acknowledgement would require a decision about what to do about them. It was present, though, in the way he looked at her across the kitchen table, in the way she'd catch herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch steps with a specificity that she didn't apply to other sounds. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a change in air pressure before weather comes. You notice it without quite being able to say what you're noticing. You just know the atmosphere is different from what it was. The second letter from Ohio arrived in January. This one was not from her mother. It was from Edmund himself, written on heavy paper with a lawyer's address at the top that she recognized as belonging to a firm in Cleveland, which told her before she'd read the first sentence that whatever was happening had moved past the category of family discussion and into something more formal. She read it standing at the kitchen counter while the morning's oatmeal finished cooking. Edmund's letter was polished in the way that Edmund was polished. The surface smooth and reasonable, the machinery underneath it moving in a direction he'd chosen before he'd started writing. The substance of it, stripped of its courteous language, was this. The farm that had been in her father's family for 2 generations was being contested. Edmund believed, and had legal counsel supporting this belief, that the arrangement by which the property had been left was incomplete, that there were matters that needed a family representative present to resolve. He named Evelyn specifically. He said that her presence was not merely requested, but, in his lawyer's considered opinion, necessary to protect her mother's claim to the property. Her mother's claim. She set the letter down and stirred the oatmeal and thought about Edmund, who had not visited when her father was dying, who had not offered help when the estate was being settled, who appeared now with the punctuality of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to arrive with lawyers and concerns. She thought about her mother, who was 61 years old and who had no particular gift for dealing with men like Edmund, and who had probably received a letter of her own that was less polished and more alarming than the one Evelyn was holding. She thought about March 15th. She put the letter in her coat pocket and went to call the children for breakfast. She told Caleb about it that evening, all of it, the first letter in November, this one now. She'd thought about whether to tell him, and had decided that not telling him was the kind of thing that caused larger problems down the line. He'd spent months dealing with the consequence of things that hadn't been said directly. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his qualities she'd come to rely on. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you have to go?" he said. "I don't know yet." She had the letter on the table between them. He's someone who creates urgency because urgency is useful to him. If I go running the moment he sends a lawyer's letter, I'm playing the game the way he wants it played. She paused. "But my mother is there, and if the farm is actually at risk, what would you need to know to decide?" She looked at him. That was the right question. Not what are you going to do, which assumed she'd already decided, not you should stay, which would have been him choosing for her. Just, what do you need to know? "I need to write to my mother directly," she said. "Find out what Edmund has actually said to her. Whether this is a real legal emergency or whether it's Edmund using legal language to manufacture one. That takes time. 2 weeks, maybe 3, for a letter there and back." She looked at the calendar she'd pinned to the kitchen wall, the one with March 15th circled in pencil, which puts us in mid-February. And if your mother needs you before then I'll go. She said it plainly, because it was plain. She's my mother. Caleb looked at the table. He was quiet in the particular way that meant he was deciding whether to say what he was thinking. "And the ranch?" he said. Not accusatory, not demanding, just asking where the thing landed. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to know what's actually happening before I can answer that." He nodded. He picked up the letter and looked at it, though she hadn't offered it. He picked it up with the easy assumption of someone who was used to looking at the documents that affected his household. And she noticed this, the assumption in it, and found that she wasn't bothered by it the way she might have been 2 months ago. He set it back down. Write the letter, he said. I'm going to. And until you know more, he paused. Until you know more, we keep working. Yes, she said. They held each other's gaze for a moment. Then she pulled the account book toward her and opened it to the page where she'd been tracking the projections for spring, and he shifted his chair to see it better, and they went back to work. The letter went to Ohio the following morning. While she waited for the answer, she did what she'd told Caleb she would do. She kept working. January on the ranch was a particular kind of endurance. The cold was established now, fully settled in, and the work of keeping the household and the animals alive through it was relentless in its demands. The cattle needed daily attention. The water troughs froze each night and had to be broken up each morning. Wood needed to be split and carried, and the stoves needed to be maintained against the cold that was always pressing at the walls, always looking for the gap in the insulation, always finding it eventually. She'd stopped noticing the cold as a separate experience from the work. It was just there, a condition of doing the things that needed doing, and you wore your coat and your wool socks and your heaviest skirt, and you did the things anyway. Elsie had recovered enough by mid-January to be underfoot again, which was the clearest possible sign that she was well. She reappeared in the kitchen with her opinions about salt and her attachment to Dorothy and her completely unironic interest in every aspect of what Evelyn was doing, and Evelyn's reaction to this was a relief so large it had a physical quality, a loosening in the chest that she hadn't known was still tight. Jonah had continued to speak. Not easily, not constantly, but consistently. A sentence here, a question there, the occasional full exchange that left both of them pleased with themselves in the oblique way of people who don't want to call too much attention to their own pleasure. He'd started going back to his school book with a seriousness that Evelyn suspected had something to do with Mara, who had been quietly and methodically helping him catch up on what he'd missed in the 14 months he hadn't been attending too much. Mara herself was changing in ways that were subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking, but clear enough once you saw them. She was lighter. Not dramatically. She was still Mara, still careful and precise and adult in her orientations. But there were moments now when she was simply a 12-year-old, just that, just a girl sitting at a table doing sums because she found them interesting, or laughing at something else he said, or asking Evelyn an irrelevant question about Ohio out of pure curiosity rather than household necessity. Those moments were the ones Evelyn held on to in the harder hours. It was Hector Briggs, of all people, who brought the news from town. He came out to the ranch on a Wednesday with the week's supplies and a look on his face that was his version of discomfort, a slight compression around the mouth, an unwillingness to make direct eye contact. He unloaded the wagon with more than his usual focus on the task, and then, when Evelyn came out to help bring the stores in, he said, in the tone of a man completing an obligation he'd been dreading, "Heard something in town you should probably know about." She waited. A couple of men from the bank were talking at the feed store, Harlan Creek Savings. He picked up a sack and didn't look at her. Talking about the Whitaker property, about spring. She kept her voice even. What were they saying? There's a man, name of Aldrich, Victor Aldrich. He runs the timber operation up near the North Ridge. He set the sack down inside the door and came back for another. Word is he's been talking to the bank about the Whitaker acreage. A pause. About what happens to it in March if the note doesn't get paid. She was quiet for a moment. He wants to buy it. That's the polite version. Hector picked up another sack without looking at her. The less polite version is he's been in conversations with the bank since before the summer. Since May, maybe earlier. And he ain't particularly concerned about whether Whitaker gets a fair price for it. He just wants the timber access on the north end, and the quickest way to get it is to wait for the note to come due. She thought about the men who had come with papers in May, whom Mara had heard through the window. She thought about the timing, the bank's 6-month extension, which now looked less like generosity and more like the minimum time required to make the legal process work while Aldrich waited. Does Caleb know about Aldrich? She said. Hector finally looked at her. His expression was the expression of a man who was delivering worse news than he'd let on initially. That's the thing, he said. I think he does. I think the bankmen told him in May. A pause. He just didn't say. She stood in the cold with that for a moment. Thank you, Hector, she said. He nodded and went back to the wagon. Well, she waited until evening. She waited until the children were in bed, waited until the house had gone quiet in that particular way it had. After 8 o'clock, when the day's noise settled. Then she went to where Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table going through the daily log he kept of the cattle's condition, and she sat down across from him and said, "Tell me about Victor Aldrich." His hand stopped moving on the page. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was deciding how much to say. She'd been watching that process for 3 months now, and she knew its shape, the brief inward turn, the assessment, the choice. "Hector told you," he said. "Yes." He set the pen down. He looked at the table for a moment. "The bankmen mentioned him in May," he said. "Said there was a party with an interest in the property. Said if I couldn't make the note, the sale to this party would be arranged to cover the debt." He was using the flat, factual voice that she recognized as his version of keeping himself steady. They made it sound like a reasonable solution. I knew it wasn't. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because—" He stopped, started again. "When you got here, I thought you were temporary. I thought you'd be like the other two. You'd see what things were like, and you'd go." He looked at her. "By the time I knew you weren't going, it felt like I'd already not told you, and going back to tell you felt like admitting I'd been keeping it from you." She looked at him. "Which you were." "Which I was." He didn't flinch from it. "I know." "What do you know about Aldrich?" "Enough." He leaned back in his chair. "He's been after the north end of this land for 4 years, since before Clara died. Mine made an offer when we were still in good standing, which I turned down, and he said at the time—" A pause. "He said he was a patient man." She thought about that. A patient man with money and timber interests, and a relationship with the bank, watching a grieving widower's finances deteriorate over 2 years. Waiting. "What's on the north end?" she said. "Old growth timber, 200 acres of it. It's the best timber in this part of the county, and the Northridge access makes it practical to log. You can get equipment in from the county road without going through town." He paused. "Clara's father wouldn't sell it. He said it was the land's backbone. Take out the old timber, and you change the watershed, and you change the whole property." He was right about that. Yes. Simple agreement. He was. She looked at the account book, which was open beside her. She thought about the numbers, the cattle, the wheat, the gap that remained between what they could generate by spring and what the note required. "How much is Aldrich paying the bank?" she said. "I don't know exactly. Enough to make them patient." "Who at the bank?" she said. Which man?" He told her. "A man named Garrett, who handled commercial accounts." She wrote the name down. "And if we go to Garrett before Aldrich does, before March, with a complete payment or close enough to it that the bank has more to gain from working with us than from the arranged sale." "We'd need to be very close," Caleb said. "Garrett's not doing this out of preference. He's doing it because Aldrich made it worth his while, and we haven't." "What would make it worth his while?" A pause. "A full payment, or enough that the remainder is a smaller risk than the arrangement with Aldrich." She sat with the numbers. She turned pages in the account book. She thought about the cattle and the wheat and her 6 months of wages and what else she hadn't thought of yet. "The south pasture," she said. He looked at her. "You're not using it. You haven't used it in 2 years from what I can see in the records. Could you lease grazing rights to Simmons for the spring and summer? He's got more cattle than his land can carry in a wet year." Caleb was quiet. "That might work. He's mentioned it." "And the wagon, the old one in the barn. Hector said there are 3 families in the county looking for a working wagon and not enough to be had." "That wagon belonged to Clara's father." She looked at him directly. "I know," she said. "I'm asking whether it can be sold." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she wasn't sure which direction it would go. "Yes," he said finally. "It can be sold." She wrote it down. They worked until 11. When she'd finished the new projections, she turned the book toward him and let him look at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. "It's still short," he said, "by less than a third of what it was." "A third short is still short." "A third short is also something we can go to Garrett with," she said. "A credible plan, a partial payment, documented assets, a lease arrangement already in place." She paused. "Aldrich's offer is certain. Our plan requires Garrett to believe we can follow through." She looked at him. "He needs a reason to believe it." "What reason?" She held his gaze. "Me," she said. "My involvement, documented. A formal arrangement that shows someone with competence is managing the financial recovery. He stared at her. You'd put your name to this. My name isn't worth much in Harlan Creek, she said, but my work is. 3 months of it. Cattle that were dying and aren't. A north field planted when it should have been left fallow. A household account that's been reduced by 20% through better management. She paused. Garrett is a commercial man. Commercial men respond to demonstrated results. You'd go to the bank with me, he said. Not quite a question. Yes. He looked at her, and there was something in the way he was looking at her, something that had been building for weeks, that was trying to find its way to the surface through all the layers of composure and grief and stubborn self-containment he'd spent 3 years reinforcing. Evelyn, he said. Her name, just that, in a voice that was different from the voice he used for everything else. She looked back at him steadily. She kept her hands flat on the table. One thing at a time, she said. Quiet. Not unkind. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the account book. One thing at a time, he agreed. What? The letter from her mother arrived in the first week of February. Her mother's handwriting was shakier than usual, which was itself information. She read it at the kitchen table early in the morning, alone, the house still sleeping around her. Her mother was frightened. Not of Edmund exactly, more of the situation Edmund had created, the lawyers and the documents and the sense of a process in motion that she didn't fully understand and couldn't stop. The letter said, He's been here twice, Evelyn. He brings a man with papers. He says things will go more easily if I sign certain things, and I don't know what I'm signing, and I don't want to sign without you here. And then, in the careful way her mother had of not asking for things directly, I know you have your situation there. I don't want to take you from it if you're needed, but I would feel better if you could come. She folded the letter. She sat with it for a long time. Caleb found her there when he came in from the early barn check. He looked at the letter in her hands, and he didn't ask, because he could see it on her face. I need to go to Ohio, she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He didn't say anything immediately, which was something she'd come to rely on, his willingness to sit with a thing before he responded to it. When? He said. Soon. My mother is... Edmund is pressuring her to sign documents she doesn't understand. If she signs the wrong thing... She stopped. I need to be there before she signs anything. The bank meeting, he said. We were going to go in the 3rd week of February. I know. She had thought about this. She had been turning it over since the letter arrived, arranging and rearranging the pieces. I can go to Ohio and be back before the 3rd week if I leave next week. It would be close, but it's possible. Montana to Ohio and back in 2 weeks. Barely. But yes. He looked at her. And if something delays you, then you go to Garrett without me, with the documentation I've prepared. She paused. It'll be less effective, but it won't be nothing. He was quiet for a moment. You've prepared documentation already. Last week, after Hector told me about Aldrich, She stopped. I started thinking about contingencies. Contingencies, he said. Something moved through his voice. You've been planning for the possibility that you'd have to leave. I've been planning for multiple possibilities, she said. That's what you do. He looked at his hands on the table. If you go to Ohio, he said, and it takes longer than you expect, or if your family needs you longer than 2 weeks, then I'll write to you. That's not what I'm asking. She looked at him. What are you asking? He raised his eyes to hers. In the early morning light, his face was tired and very direct, the management stripped away entirely. I'm asking if you're coming back. The question sat in the air between them. She thought about the right answer, not the easy answer, the right one, the honest one, with all its uncertainty still in it, unsmoothed. I want to come back, she said. That's true, and I won't pretend otherwise. She held his gaze. But I don't know what I'll find when I get there. I don't know what Edmund has done or what my mother needs or how long it takes to fix it, so I can't make you a promise about exactly when. A pause. What I can tell you is that I intend to come back. That's not the same as a guarantee, but it's the truth. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. She nodded and picked up the letter and stood. I'll start getting the documentation in order for Garrett today, she said. I want everything laid out clearly enough that you can walk in there and present it without me. She moved to the stove to start the coffee. And I need to talk to Mara. Mara? She's been doing the books with me for 2 months. She knows where everything is and how it's organized. While I'm gone, she can keep the ledger current so you're not going into the bank meeting with outdated numbers. She looked at him. She's more capable than you know, Caleb. He said slowly, I know she's capable. I don't think you know how much, she said gently. I think you see how much she manages and it worries you because no child should manage that much. Which is right. But there's a difference between managing out of necessity because no one else will and managing because you're genuinely gifted at it. She paused. Mara has the gift. When the necessity is lifted, the gift remains. He was quiet for a moment. She gets it from her mother, he said. Clara was the same way. Numbers, organization. He paused. I never told her that enough. Tell her now, Evelyn said. He looked at her. She's here, Evelyn said. Tell her now, while there's time. Well, she told the children the following morning at breakfast. She'd thought about how to do it, and she'd decided that straightforward was the only approach that wouldn't cause more anxiety than the thing itself. Mara and Jonah were old enough for the truth, and Elsie was young enough that the truth, delivered calmly, would register as calm. I need to go to Ohio for a little while, she said. My mother needs me to help with something. Elsie looked up from her porridge. How long? 2 weeks? Maybe a little more. That's a lot of days. It is, but I'm coming back. She looked at each of them in turn. I want you to know that clearly. I'm coming back. Mara was looking at her plate. Her expression was the one she wore when she was keeping something carefully inside. Jonah said, When are you leaving? End of next week. He nodded. He went back to eating. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his body had registered the information and was processing it in the careful, private way he processed everything. After breakfast, when Caleb had gone to the barn and Elsie was occupied with Dorothy, Mara came to find her in the pantry room where she was beginning to organize what she'd need for the trip. Mara stood in the doorway with her arms crossed in the self-protective posture she'd mostly stopped using over the past 3 months. You're going to Ohio, she said. Yes. Are you actually coming back? Evelyn looked at her directly. Yes. Mara's jaw moved. The other two said things. The women who were here before you. She paused. They didn't mean them the way they said them. I know. Evelyn held her gaze. I'm not them. How do I know that? It was a fair question. It was possibly the most honest question anyone in this household had asked her, because it came without any of the protective softening that adults put around such things. Mara was asking it cleanly, with her 12-year-old's directness. How do I know? Evelyn thought about what she could say. She thought about promises, which were only as good as the person making them and the circumstances keeping them. She thought about what she actually had to offer. You don't know, she said. Not for certain. That's the truth. She paused. But I've left things here that I wouldn't leave if I weren't coming back. My ledger, my sewing kit, my father's almanac, which is the one thing I kept from when he died. She paused again. I don't leave things that matter somewhere I'm not returning to. Mara looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through her face, not the full release of worry, which was too large to release all at once, but a partial loosening. Okay, she said. She turned and went back down the hall. Evelyn stood in the pantry room with her father's almanac in her hand, which she'd taken off the shelf to show Mara that it was there, and had instead ended up holding while she made a promise that she intended with every part of herself to keep. She set it back on the shelf. She went to write the letters she needed to write, one to her mother, one to Edmund's lawyers, and one to Garrett at the bank, which she'd discussed with Caleb and which laid out, in precise and documented terms, the recovery plan for the Whitaker Ranch and the arrangements that were in place, and the clear message that the property was being actively and competently managed by people who intended to remain in it. She wrote the last sentence of Garrett's letter twice before she was satisfied with it. This ranch has the resources, the management, and the commitment to meet its obligations. We ask only for the opportunity already afforded to us, and we expect to make full use of it. She signed it. She said it with the others. Outside, the February light was doing something that wasn't quite thaw. Too early for that, too cold still. But the quality of it was different from the January light, less flat, more angular, carrying just the faintest suggestion that the season had turned a degree or two towards something other than itself. She looked at the light on the kitchen floor, and she thought about the north field under its snow, and the cattle that had come back from the edge, and the roses she'd promised to plant in spring, and the girl down the hall who had finally let herself be 12 years old again. She thought about Caleb's voice saying her name the way he'd said it. Just that, just Evelyn, and what had been in it. She picked up the letters and put her coat on, and went to find Caleb to go over the bank documentation one more time before she left, because there were still things to do, and doing them was what she knew how to give. She was gone 19 days. Ohio in February was the Ohio she remembered, gray and cold, but a softer cold than Montana, the kind that settled rather than cut, the kind that came with bare elm trees and muddy roads, and the particular smell of a house where someone had been burning the same kind of wood in the same kind of stove for 30 years. Her mother met her at the depot in Columbus looking smaller than she remembered, which happened every time she came home. Her mother shrank slightly with each visit, as though the years were a slow, patient pressure. Edmund had done what Edmund did. He had created a situation that was real enough to be alarming and complicated enough that an elderly woman alone wouldn't know how to navigate it, and he had arrived with lawyers and waited for the confusion to do his work for him. The farm was not in genuine legal peril. There were documents that needed clarifying, a portion of the original deed that had an ambiguity Edmund's lawyers had identified and were prepared to exploit if no one pushed back. Evelyn pushed back. She sat across a table from Edmund's lawyer in a cold office in Cleveland and asked questions until the man's answers became less confident, and then she asked the questions again differently. And by the end of the second day, the ambiguity had been resolved in her mother's favor by an independent assessment that Edmund had not anticipated she would know to request. Edmund left without saying goodbye, which she took as confirmation that she'd done the right thing. She spent 4 days with her mother after that. They sat in the kitchen of the house she'd grown up in and drank coffee and talked about small things, her mother's garden, the neighbor's new horse, the winter preserves that had turned out better than expected. Her mother asked about Montana with the careful interest of someone trying to understand a life they couldn't quite picture. Evelyn described the ranch and the children and the north field under snow, and she watched her mother's face while she described these things, watched the particular attention that came over it. "You sound different," her mother said on the third day. "Different how?" Her mother looked at her coffee. "Settled," she said. "You sound settled, like someone who knows where they are." Evelyn looked at the kitchen window, at the familiar Ohio light coming through the familiar glass. "I think I do," she said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "The man," she said, "the widower. His name is Caleb. Is he a good man?" She thought about this honestly, about the flower shelf and the dead roses and the 14 months of silence he'd allowed to go on too long, and the grief he'd carried so inwardly that it had become indistinguishable from the walls of the house. She thought about 4 in the morning in a cold kitchen with a sick child and his voice saying, "Elsie girl, I'm right here." She thought about him sitting across a table from her with the account book between them, asking the right questions. "He's a complicated man," she said. "He's trying to be better than his grief made him. That's about as much as you can ask of anyone." Her mother nodded slowly. "Come home if you need to," she said, "but I think you know where home is now." She left the following morning. The train back to Montana felt shorter than the train out, which she knew was only the difference between traveling toward something and traveling away from it. She watched the landscape change through the window, Ohio's gentle hills giving way to the flatlands rising slowly toward the mountains. And she thought about the letter she'd sent Caleb from Columbus, which had told him she was coming and gave a date, and which she'd written and rewritten 3 times before settling on the version that said what she meant without saying more than she was ready to say. She arrived in Harlan Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks and 5 days after she'd left. The wagon was there at the depot. Not Hector Briggs driving it, Caleb. He was standing beside the horse when she came off the platform, his hat in his hands the way it had been that first evening in the kitchen when he didn't know what to do with the situation in front of him. He looked like himself, worn from winter, tired around the eyes, the beard he'd grown since November still unfamiliar to her in small ways. He looked relieved. He looked like a man who had been waiting and was now done waiting and hadn't quite reorganized himself around the fact yet. "The children wanted to come," he said. "I made them stay." probably wise. Elsie cried. She'll recover. She set her bag down. She looked at him. How did it go with Garrett? Something shifted in his face. We should talk about that. Tell me now. He looked at the mountain line for a moment. Garrett agreed to a payment arrangement, the partial payment, the lease with Simmons, the documentation you'd prepared. A pause. He turned down Aldrich. She let out a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding. The wheat coming up in April was the thing that convinced him, Caleb said. A documented crop in the ground. Something visible. He paused. He said it showed someone was thinking past the immediate situation. Mara kept the ledger current? Every entry. She came with me to the bank. He said this with a quality in his voice she hadn't heard before, not quite pride, because it was larger than pride, something more like wonder at a thing discovered. She sat in that office and answered Garrett's questions about the accounts without looking at me once, like she'd been doing it for years. She has her mother's gift for it, Evelyn said. Yes. He looked at her. You told me to tell her that. Did you? On the way home from the bank. He was quiet a moment. She cried. Just a little. Then she told me I should have said it sooner. A pause. She was right. Evelyn looked at him. He was looking back at her with that same direct quality from the kitchen in February, the management absent, just himself. I need to say something to you, he said. All right. While you were gone, those 19 days, I understood something I'd been not understanding for a while. He stopped, organized himself. I built walls after Clara died. I know that. I know the children paid for it, and the ranch paid for it, and anyone who tried to get close to it paid for it. He looked at his hat and his hands. You didn't stop coming. You just kept doing the next thing, and the thing after that, and you didn't ask me to be different before I was ready. You just waited. I'm patient, she said. You're not actually that patient, he said. You're direct and you're blunt, and you moved my flower shelf. Something in his voice that was almost the laugh she'd been waiting 3 months to hear fully. But you were patient about the things that needed it, and He stopped again. I don't want you to be hired help. I haven't wanted that for a long time. I want you to stay because you belong here. Because this family is yours, if you want it. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the $31 and the worn leather bag and Margaret Hollis on the platform saying plain as a fence post. She thought about the flower shelf and Jonah's 4 words in the notebook, and Elsie's hand reaching for Dorothy in the middle of a fever that might have gone the other way. She thought about Mara sitting at the kitchen table with her pencil and her serious eyes and her 12-year-old's precise, unflinching gift for the truth. She thought about her mother's word. Settled. I left my father's almanac on the shelf, she said. He looked at her. I told Mara, I don't leave things that matter in places I'm not returning to. She held his gaze. I came back, Caleb. He stood there with his hat in his hands in the February cold on the Harlan Creek Depot platform, and what crossed his face then was not the almost smile or the controlled expression or the management she'd spent months watching him maintain. It was something simple and unguarded and completely itself. He reached out and took her hand. Just that. He held it for a moment in the cold. Let's go home, he said. They married in April when the ground was soft enough to plant. It was a small thing. The justice of the peace in Harlan Creek, the children as witnesses, Hector Briggs standing in the back with his hat over his chest, in the posture of a man attending an event he considers personally significant but has no intention of discussing afterward. Even Dora Sims came, without Margaret Hollis, which was itself a kind of statement. The roses went into the garden bed the following week. Not the same ones. New ones, different variety, red and stubborn, and not particularly elegant. Evelyn had gotten the rootstock from a woman in town who'd grown them for 15 years and said they could survive anything, and she believed it. Elsie helped plant them, or provided consultation on the planting, which amounted to the same thing in Elsie's view. The north field came up in April, thin in the corners where the drainage had been wrong, stronger in the center, nothing like a perfect crop but enough to matter. Caleb walked the rows on the first morning it was visible, and Evelyn walked beside him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying about green coming up out of ground you'd worked in frozen November with your hands that hurt from the cold. The banknote was paid in full on the 14th of March, one day early. Evelyn had insisted on the one day, which Caleb had found slightly absurd and had agreed to anyway, because he'd learned that when she insisted on something specific, the specificity was usually the point. Garrett, when they paid, said something about having been glad to work with them. Caleb thanked him. Evelyn thanked him and meant it less, but managed to say it in a way that sounded genuine because some skills are worth having even when the situation doesn't entirely deserve them. Victor Aldrich, she heard, had turned his interest toward a timber operation in the next county. She did not hear this with satisfaction exactly, more with the flat recognition of a problem that had resolved itself in the right direction and could now be set down. Jonah spoke freely by summer. Not always. Not about everything. He was still a boy who lived partly in his interior, who chose his words and his moments, who had a quietness in him that she suspected would be there his whole life, and was not a deficit, but simply the shape of him. But he laughed now. She heard it on a July afternoon coming from the barn where he and Caleb were doing something with the horses, that particular sound of a boy laughing at his father. And she stood in the garden with her hands in the dirt and listened to it and felt it land in her chest like something warm. Mara was 13 by summer and had started keeping the accounts entirely on her own. Evelyn reviewed them, but there was less and less to correct. The girl had a precision that was her own, not taught, or not only taught, a natural instinct for the relationship between numbers and the physical reality they represented. Evelyn had written to a woman she knew in Columbus who ran a school, asking about what kind of education was available for a girl with a gift for figures and organization. The answer was not encouraging, because the answer was almost never encouraging on that particular subject in 1884. But she kept the letter, and she kept asking. What she'd learned, living that year on the Whitaker Ranch, was something she didn't have a single clean way to say. It was this, that showing up is underestimated. Not the dramatic showing up, not the showing up for the crisis, though she'd done that too. The other kind, the 4 a.m. kind. The kind where you make someone coffee and fix someone's doll and move the flower back to the wrong shelf because some things matter more than being right. The kind where you stay when staying is hard and the evidence that it's worth it hasn't fully arrived yet. She'd come to Montana with $31 and a leather bag and the suspicion that somewhere in the world there was work that would use all of her, not just the parts that were convenient or presentable or easy to accommodate. She'd been right about that, it turned out. She just hadn't known what form it would take. The form it took was a broken-down ranch and 3 children and a man with walls around him and a banknote due in March. And none of that was what she'd imagined, and all of it was what she'd needed. The woman nobody wanted turned out to be exactly what 4 people couldn't do without. She had arrived believing she had nothing to offer a place like this. She left that belief on the train platform in Harlan Creek the morning she arrived, somewhere between Margaret Hollis's voice and the first sight of those mountains, in the cold October air that had smelled like snow coming and had been entirely right about that. She walked into a broken house and she stayed. That was all. That was everything.
Oh, thank you so much for the follow. Appreciate it. You're welcome to stay anonymous if you like, or if you want to say hello, you're welcome to too. We are a lurk-friendly stream. I think we're gonna stay up a bit late, y'all. If anyone wants to hang out for a while, you're welcome to. Yeah, we're gonna be on for a bit. Um, Yeah, this is going all right. Not too bad. Looking pretty cozy.